We really are living in such an amazing time on our planet or in humanity because we are able to see things beyond our planet that no one has ever seen before. This image right here is of the Stevens Quintet and was photographed by the James Webb Telescope. There's been many projects that have led us to our current understanding of the celestial world beyond our planet. In this video, my hope is to introduce you and maybe give you a little historical lesson on some of the space projects that have led us to where we are today. Let's get started. So, the beginning, let's start with NASA. NASA, founded in the United States as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. That's where we get those letters from. And this was actually founded in 1953. So some people watching this may have been born before that or remember when NASA was being found. So this is an independent government agency, and their mission is they are responsible for the civil space program, aeronautics research, and space research, right? So the civil space program, that is civilians sending members to space, this is not linked to the military, although there are some overlaps in some of the programs. So here is one of the original logos. Here's maybe a little more modern one. The headquarters of NASA are located, of course, in Washington, D.C. It is a government agency. So a little information about NASA, but the more interesting part is, of course, talking about what they do. Well, what they do is accomplished at where they do it at all these little field locations. So you've probably heard of several of these, but I want to go over the main field locations for NASA. The first one is the Ames Research Center, and this is in California. We see they've got some wind tunnel work there. They also are doing a lot of astrobiology, right? Thinking about what life could be out in space. Then we have the Armstrong Flight Research Center. That's in California. And they are really working on some advanced aircraft there in California. The Glenn Research Center, named after John Glenn, is in Ohio. And they really work on propulsion, right? The propulsion technology to get those rockets up, and working on power storage. Okay, so what you've seen from just these first three is that these different centers, these different field locations, specialize in different things for NASA. The Goddard Space Flight Center, they really work on observations of space. They're located in Maryland, and the James Webb Telescope, which is actually being assembled there, who took that picture I led the whole video with, that was actually the work of the Goddard Space Flight Center. Then the JPL in California, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, that, as you would know, is all about that research in getting those rockets and the propulsion forward. There is a lot of work there in conjunction with Caltech. That's there in California. Then the Johnson Space Center, which we see a lot in movies or we see a lot maybe on the news, that's where our spaceflight training is. So if you want to be an astronaut, and that's also where flight control is, right? You can see the people here in flight control, and that's in Houston, Texas. Then the Kennedy Space Center, right? These are maybe you've heard of a little more. This is our launch center. This is located in Florida, and this is where we actually launch the rockets, the spacecraft. Then we have Langley Research Center. You can see this is a really big wind tunnel there, and that's in Virginia, Langley. And they're into a lot of research, right? So it's a big government research center. The Marshall Space Flight Center, they are all about rocketry and propulsion as well. And that's located in Alabama. The last big field location I wanted to mention is the Stennis Space Center, which is actually in Mississippi. Maybe you didn't know there was a space center in Mississippi. And that's a primary site for rocket engine testing. Okay, so you've maybe heard of one or two of these, but the reason I wanted to introduce you to all of these is so that you understand sending astronauts, sending rockets into space is not easy. it takes a lot of people working at various locations doing different type of work to actually have a successful program. All right, so what were some of the early NASA projects? Well, in 1958, they started the Mercury project. There's the logo. And really, this produced the Freedom 7, which sent Alan Shepard as the first American into space, and also the Friendship 7, which sent John Glenn as the first American launched into orbit. Okay, so these were big at the time in the 50s, right? There was a race between us and other countries who could do this first. So Alan Shepard was the first American in space, and John Glenn the first into orbit. Then in the 60s, we started the Gemini project, and the Gemini project really was about 10 missions, about 14 days, and they were doing some other things in space, right? We see a spacewalk here. Right, getting out of the actual spacecraft, doing a spacewalk. They were working on the docking, and then the idea of humans in space doing some medical testing. Okay, then we get to the 60s and the late 60s, early 70s, and the famous Apollo missions, and that's where we have Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon. The Apollo 11, they were the first to do that. Now, of course, this all started, JFK was wanting to beat the Soviets to the moon, so this Apollo project really united the United States in having sort of a common goal to sort of reach the moon. Okay, so those were some of the early NASA projects that we see. And then later into the 70s, we see the beginning of Skylab, which was America's first space station, right? Actually trying to put a station that stayed in space up in above our atmosphere. Okay, so early NASA projects, 50s to 70s. Now, just to give you a little size comparison of those three missions, right? I told you first was the Mercury, right? Carrying John Glenn. Then we moved to the Gemini, which we see there. Now that can hold two, but just look at the different space configuration. We've got two people there. And then finally the Apollo that was going to the moon. Notice we have space for 3. So if you're looking at the comparison of what they look standing up, right, the Apollo was much, much bigger. So some more recent NASA projects. We started the Space Shuttle program in 1972. And that actually gave us 135 missions, the most famous of which was a tragedy. The Challenger disaster in 1986. I actually remember being in school. I was in elementary school. And they took us all into the library because we were going to watch the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger because it had the first woman, Sally Ride, to go into space. And I remember we all went to the library where there's a TV, right? This was in 1986. And all these kids, my friends, we were watching this. Oh, the first woman going into space, so cool. And then I remember as a child watching this thing explode. And I looked around at the teachers and I was like, is this supposed to happen? And obviously it wasn't. And the horror, the crying, the look on their faces, I remember to this day this Challenger event, how when it happened. So that space shuttle program lasted till roughly about 2011. And then another program, of course, we started was the International Space Station, also known as the ISS, which was a joint venture with the Soviet Mir 2, European Columbus, and the Japanese Kibo. And there you can see the International Space Station. We are still sending people to live in the International Space Station, to work, to study, to do research. A really cool joint collaboration between the Soviets, Europeans, and Japanese with the United States. Now, our current sort of project where we are is called Artemis. And this is the new generation of the crewed spaceflight program. Okay. So our next goal, what we're working on, and they've actually just recently announced some of this stuff, is to land America's first woman and the next man on the moon. So we're going back to the moon. And then also Artemis is one of the goals is to construct a lunar gateway, sort of like a little small space station that orbits the moon. And that could be for docking, for fuel, for lots of things, for things that maybe need to go further in the future. Okay, so some really cool programs. There is part of the Artemis program, and here's an artist rendition of what that lunar gateway orbiting the moon might look like. Okay, so you can't really talk about NASA's projects without talking about some really cool things, the Mars rover projects. So we haven't sent humans to Mars yet, but we've got some equipment on Mars, the rovers. And what we see here is the first sort of rendition of this was the Opportunity. And this is just an artist rendering of what that looks like. There's the rover going around, collecting samples, taking images, sending them back to Earth. Then we sent Curiosity, right? We got a little more technology, a little more advanced to get some more stuff. So this is actually a self-portrait of the rover on Mars, taken in 2021. The most recent one we sent, Perseverance, that landed. This was a big deal because it actually has a sky crane and landed in a different way. This one is much more advanced, and people at NASA were really excited to get Perseverance to Mars to get it landed safely. And it's going about Mars, doing all of our data collection, picture taking as well. So it's crazy to think that we have sent things to other planets, to Mars. This is a different world, different planets that we're actually looking at and roaming around. All right, pretty fascinating stuff. In addition to actually sending things to local planets, we are also wanting to know what is out there, right? So NASA has really also been in charge of some major space telescopes. And I'm going to talk about two big ones. The Hubble, this is just a picture of it being released into orbit after it was serviced in 2009, but actually it was around before then. And this Carina Nebula, this was actually a picture taken by the Hubble Space Telescope in 2010, right? To think about what could actually be out there. So these space telescopes are doing that. Then the one that's in the most recent news, which hopefully you've seen, is the James Webb Space Telescope. That's in orbit, and that was launched in 2022, and we are getting some amazing pictures from there. There is the same nebula, but it's showing a little more detailed, enhanced view of the cosmic cliffs. So James Webb Space Telescope is really giving us some amazing pictures of what's out there in our universe. So we also have NASA being responsible for sending some satellites into space. So you may not believe it or understand, but there are thousands of satellites orbiting our planet. And so these are just an example of several of the satellites as of February 2015 that NASA's Earth Science Division are operating. And they do all sorts of stuff, from weather observation, from climate change analysis. They're doing lots of really interesting things and sending back information to us on Earth. In addition to sending satellites into space, we actually have what we call near space network. So things that are maybe up pretty high, some of these satellites, right, you're thinking about in the mountains in Arkansas or way up high north in Norway. So we operate, or NASA operates, a lot of these space satellites, telescopes, what you may want to call them, really more satellites or ground stations, all around the world. So over here in the East Coast where I am, there's one in Virginia, Maryland, and actually down in Florida. If you go out west, okay, there's actually one in New Mexico. And then way up, we've got several in Arkansas, even a really interesting one out there in Hawaii. If you ever go visit Hawaii, you might be able to see that. And then, of course, around the world, Australia has some, down in South America and Chile. That's a really interesting one as well. So we're in space. We're here. We're sending spaceships, right? Doing a lot of really interesting things for our National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So let's take a turn now. So we've talked a lot about NASA. That is a government Institute, National Aeronautics Space Administration. But there's recently popped up a few more businesses, some commercial space industries. And one of the big ones that you've probably heard of is SpaceX. SpaceX is a private space company founded by Elon Musk, right? There's a picture of some of their work space. And Elon Musk, love him or hate him, right? He has done lots of really interesting things in the United States. And the goal, or what he claimed was the goal, the stated goal, was to reduce space transportation costs, right? Elon thought he could do it cheaper than the government, and eventually enable the colonization of Mars, right? That is something we are planning to go to Mars. And so Elon's goal with SpaceX, or their intended or stated goal, was actually to get better at space travel, at these transportation costs, and so we could send more people into space, eventually to Mars. So another really interesting offshoot of SpaceX, and I bring this up because I actually have this at my mountain cabin because you can't get internet. We're way up high on a mountain, right? And we're not getting any fiber or anything up there. So I actually bought Starlink so I could get high-speed internet up there. And that is a really other interesting thing they've done. And the way that they've done this is they'll ship you a little satellite dish, but the reason he improved, or Starlink has improved internet so much, is that they have lots of low Earth orbit satellites. So they launch these, and these satellites, of course, go around the Earth in a lower orbit than some of the other satellites that are up higher. So that means the lag time on getting internet is actually better, and you can actually get quite good speeds of internet using his Starlink, right? Now, this is not an advertisement, but it's worked well for me, as long as, of course, there's no tree in the way blocking the view of space. And more recently, interesting enough, SpaceX is now responsible for transporting crew members to and from the International Space Station, right? So NASA is really no longer doing that on their own. SpaceX has been contracted to be responsible for getting our crew members back and forth to the International Space Station, right? So really interesting. So what is the history of SpaceX? Well, they actually have had 3 launch vehicles. They started with a Falcon 1. That was their first successful launch, reached orbit in 2008. Then they went ahead and retired that in 2009. Then they worked for a while on the Falcon 9. This was more of a medium lift, and they can lift up to 50,000 pounds into orbit as well. And this is able to dock with the International Space Station. So their newest then rendition is Falcon Heavy. So you can see they've combined a few rockets there. And this can deliver 147,000 pounds, right? So that's what, 70-some tons into orbit. And the Falcon Heavy, there was a media thing, you got to market, actually launched Elon's Tesla, his own personal Tesla Roadster, into orbit in 2018, right? So it could take a car. Pretty interesting stuff. Now, where is SpaceX today? Well, I told you they're now delivering crew. They're responsible for delivering crew to the International Space Station. So they designed this Dragon, SpaceX's Dragon, which is going to be able to deliver crew to the ISS. So that's where the crew will be, and they'll be able to then move out over into the International Space Station. They are also working on SpaceX's Starship, right? So remember, Elon wanted to make it more affordable. So they're trying to now work on a reusable spaceship. So something that can be launched several times, whether that's going to take cargo to the International Space Station, or their Starlink satellites into space. They want to be able to reuse the spaceships and actually have them land. They actually have developed also sort of a landing pad that they want these things to be able to land back on instead of sort of breaking up and falling in the ocean. All right, so we've talked NASA, we've talked SpaceX. The other one that you may have heard about is good old Jeffrey Bezos. and that is the creation of Blue Origin. So Blue Origins is just an American aerospace defense and space exploration company founded by our very own Jeff Bezos, who you know was the founder of Amazon and CEO of Amazon. There's their logo, Blue Origin. So Bezos' idea is a little different than Elon's. He actually is a little more interested in space exploration and the space tourism industry, it seems. He's produced 3 engines, and they're working on a 4th right now, Blue Origins has. And they launched their first successful crew in July 2021 in the New Shepard, right? It was Jeff, and I think this was his brother, a few other people into space on their Blue Origin. Now, since then, the New Shepard, right, that's their rocket, looks kind of odd to me. It's kind of looks a little different than some of the other ones. Has performed several flights now, and they have taken some celebrities, right, including old Strahan there, and then Shatner, Bill Shatner, who was in Star Trek. So there's a little, it's not irony, but it's a little nod to all his work on space exploration as an actor, and then he actually now has gotten to go into space. Okay, so where's the future, right? Well, it's really interesting. We're at an interesting time. We have NASA, the government agency, doing a lot of research. Now we have SpaceX and Blue Origins. Who knows where we'll be in the next decade or next generation as more and more people get to experience flight. And then as we plan ultimately to send a group of people to live on the moon, to live perhaps in Mars, and then explore the deeper parts of our galaxies even more, right? Exciting times to be alive, to be a human living in this world where we're seeing new and exciting things happen.